The moment he grabbed her jacket, his career was already over. He just didn't know it yet. The courthouse steps in downtown Washington, D.C. were alive with movement, the kind that never really stopped. Lawyers rushing with leather briefcases, reporters adjusting microphones, the low hum of conversations blending with the distant echo of sirens blocks away. It was just past 9 a.m., the air crisp, hovering around 58 degrees, the kind of morning that made every breath feel sharp and real. And right in the middle of it all stood Officer Daniel Brooks, chest out, voice loud, presence heavy like he owned not just the steps, but the space itself. His hand tightened around the fabric of a woman's dark navy jacket, pulling it forward with sudden force, the motion sharp enough to turn heads but controlled enough to look official. "Don't move," he said, his tone clipped, carrying authority that expected obedience without question. Conversations nearby faltered. A few people slowed. Others stopped completely. Phones tilted slightly upward, subtle but intentional. The woman didn't resist. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. Vanessa Cole simply stood there, her posture straight, her gaze level, her breathing steady as if none of this surprised her. The early sunlight caught the edge of her glasses, reflecting just enough to hide her eyes for a second, and in that second, something about her stillness felt wrong. Not weak, not afraid, just unmoved. Brooks frowned at that. He was used to reactions, nervous glances, quick explanations, raised voices, anything that confirmed he was in control. But this silence didn't cooperate. It didn't bend. "What are you hiding?" he pressed, louder this time, making sure the growing crowd could hear, his words cutting through the morning air like a line drawn in concrete. A few murmurs rippled through the bystanders. Someone whispered. Someone else shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa's hands remained at her sides, fingers relaxed, not clenched, not defensive. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes, and for a brief moment, the noise around them seemed to dull, like the world itself was holding its breath. Imagine standing there, surrounded by strangers, being questioned, judged, reduced to suspicion in seconds, and yet feeling something entirely different beneath it all. Not fear, not panic, but patience. Brooks tugged the jacket again, as if expecting something to fall out, something to justify the scene he had already created. Nothing did. The fabric settled back into place, smooth, undisturbed, almost indifferent to his effort. A man near the courthouse doors exchanged a glance with a colleague. A woman holding a legal folder hesitated mid-step. There was a shift, small, almost invisible, but real. Brooks didn't notice it. Not yet. His focus stayed locked on Vanessa, on proving something, on asserting something that, to him, had never been questioned before. "You people think you can just walk in here like you belong," he muttered, quieter now, but still sharp, the kind of sentence meant to sting even when half heard. Vanessa didn't respond. She didn't need to, because somewhere beneath the surface of that moment, beneath the noise, the authority, the assumption, something had already begun to turn. And the only person who couldn't feel it was the one who had just set it in motion. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the courthouse steps like an invisible weight pressing down on every person standing there. And for the first time that morning, the rhythm of the place fell off, like something had slipped out of alignment, and no one could quite name it yet. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance slightly, the confidence in his posture still there, but now edged with something tighter, something less certain, because the reaction he expected never came. And without it, his authority had nothing to push against, nothing to dominate, just a woman standing in front of him who refused to play the role he had already assigned her. A reporter near the base of the steps lowered his microphone just a fraction, eyes narrowing, not in confusion but in curiosity, while a pair of junior attorneys paused halfway up the stairs, exchanging a quick glance that said more than words could, because they had seen enough of these moments to recognize when something was about to turn. Brooks exhaled through his nose, sharper this time, and adjusted his grip before letting the jacket fall back into place, smoothing it down with a motion that was meant to look controlled, professional, deliberate, as if everything happening was exactly as it should be, but the movement felt forced, rehearsed, like a script that no longer matched the scene. "I asked you a question," he said, louder again, trying to reclaim the space, trying to pull the moment back, under his control, but The words did not land the same way they had seconds earlier. They did not carry the same weight. And somewhere in the background, a low murmur began to rise. Not loud, not disruptive, but present enough to signal that the crowd was no longer simply watching. They were starting to think. Vanessa Cole tilted her head just slightly, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady behind the faint reflection of morning light. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, almost quiet, yet it carried with a clarity that cut clean through the noise around them. "Officer, is there a reason you are detaining me?" The question hung there, simple on the surface, but precise in a way that shifted the ground beneath his feet, because it was not defensive, it was not emotional, it was procedural, and in that difference lay something Brooks was not prepared for. He opened his mouth to respond, then paused, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause, the balance tilted further, subtle but undeniable. A courthouse security officer standing near the entrance straightened, his attention now fully locked on the interaction, while a woman holding a stack of case files slowly stepped back, creating just a little more space, as if instinctively distancing herself from what was unfolding. Brooks cleared his throat, the sound dry, and forced a short laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. "You match a description," he said, the words coming out firm but thinner than before, lacking the certainty that usually backed them. And as soon as he said it, the explanation felt insufficient, even to him. Vanessa did not move, did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply held his gaze, and in that stillness, something shifted again, something deeper this time, like the quiet before a storm that no one had realized was forming. A man near the top of the steps leaned toward his colleague and whispered something under his breath, and though the words were not clear, the tone was cautious, uncertain, alert. Brooks felt it now, not fully, not clearly, but enough to register that the moment was no longer entirely his, that the control he assumed was absolute had begun to slip in ways he could not yet explain, and still, he pushed forward, because stepping back was not something he knew how to do. Not here, not in front of an audience. "I am going to need to see identification," he said, each word deliberate, measured, as if precision alone could restore authority. But even as the sentence left his mouth, the air around them had already changed, and the woman standing in front of him, calm, composed, unshaken, looked less like someone being questioned and more like someone waiting for something inevitable to arrive. For a moment, no one moved, and that stillness carried more weight than any command he could have given, because when authority is real, it does not need to repeat itself, and when it starts to slip, everyone feels it before anyone says it. Officer Daniel Brooks extended his hand slightly, palm open, waiting, expecting compliance, expecting the familiar rhythm to return, but Vanessa Cole did not reach for a purse, did not fumble through pockets, did not show even the smallest sign of urgency. Instead, she let a single second pass, then another, each one stretching longer than it should have, each one quietly dismantling the pace he was trying to control. A faint breeze moved through the courthouse steps, lifting the edges of papers, brushing against jackets, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic from Constitution Avenue. And in that ordinary movement, the tension in the air became even more noticeable, like a contrast that made everything sharper. Brooks felt it now in a way he could not ignore, the subtle shift in how people were looking at him, not with automatic agreement, not with silent approval, but with something closer to scrutiny, and that feeling, unfamiliar and unwelcome, pressed against his confidence like a crack forming beneath the surface. "Identification," he repeated, this time slower, more deliberate, as if control could be rebuilt word by word. But the repetition only highlighted the fact that the first command had not been enough. Vanessa finally moved, not quickly, not reactively, but with a calm precision that seemed entirely her own, her hand slipping inside the inner lining of her jacket with a motion so controlled it almost felt rehearsed, yet not for his benefit, not for the crowd, but for something else entirely. A man near the courthouse entrance straightened further, his expression tightening as if recognition hovered just out of reach, while the security officer by the door shifted his weight, eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in realization. Brooks watched her hand disappear into the fabric, and for a brief second, a flicker of anticipation crossed his face, because this was the moment he understood, the moment where proof would appear, where his suspicion would be validated, where the narrative he had already constructed would finally align with reality. But that expectation carried something else now, something less certain, something edged with doubt. Vanessa paused before pulling anything out, just long enough for the silence to return, just long enough for the space between them to feel heavier than before, and when she looked up again, meeting his eyes directly, there was no defiance there, no fear, just clarity, the kind that does not argue because it does not need to. "Of course," she said softly, her voice steady, measured, almost patient, as if she were acknowledging a process rather than responding to an accusation. And that tone, calm and composed, landed differently than anything he had heard so far, because it did not resist him, it did not submit to him. It simply existed outside of him. Somewhere in the crowd, a whisper moved, subtle but sharp, and another followed, like a ripple traveling through still water, and though the words were not clear, the effect was attention sharpening, awareness shifting, the entire scene inching closer to something none of them could fully see yet. Brooks adjusted his stance again, squaring his shoulders, grounding himself in posture, in presence, in everything that had always worked before. But beneath that effort, something was beginning to unravel, not dramatically, not visibly, but internally, like a certainty that no longer held its shape. Vanessa's fingers closed around something inside her jacket, and as she slowly began to draw it out, the movement carried a quiet finality, not rushed, not hesitant, just inevitable. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to tighten, the sounds of the city fading just enough for every small detail to stand out. The shift of a shoe on concrete, the faint click of a camera adjusting focus, the controlled breath of a man realizing he might already be too far into something he did not understand. And Brooks, standing there with his hands still partially extended, felt it clearly now, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a feeling he could not shake, that whatever came next was not going to confirm his control, it was going to redefine it. What she pulled out was not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, and that difference was everything. Because while Officer Daniel Brooks expected a quick movement, something defensive, something that would justify the tension he had created, what he got instead was control, steady and unshaken. As Vanessa Cole slid a slim leather holder into view, holding it at chest level without extending it toward him, without offering it, simply presenting it as a fact that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. The sunlight caught the edge of the seal embossed on its surface, a subtle glint that drew the attention of more than just Brooks. And for a brief second, the space between them felt smaller, tighter, as if everything around them had leaned in without physically moving. Brooks narrowed his eyes, focusing, trying to read it before it was even opened, trying to stay ahead of a moment that was already slipping beyond him. And when she finally flipped it open, the motion was slow enough to be intentional, controlled enough to feel final. There it was, clear, unmistakable, the kind of identification that did not need explanation, the kind that did not require validation, the kind that spoke in a language authority understood instantly. Brooks stared at it, and for the first time since this began, he did not speak right away, because what he was looking at did not fit the version of reality he had been operating in just seconds ago, and the gap between those two things, expectation and truth, widened faster than he could close it. A quiet shift moved through the crowd, sharper now, more defined, whispers turning into recognition, heads tilting, eyes widening just enough to signal that something significant had just entered the scene. The courthouse security officer near the entrance took a step forward, not aggressively, not urgently, but with a measured awareness that suggested he understood exactly what he was seeing, and that understanding carried weight. Vanessa did not move her hand, did not lower the identification. She simply held it there, allowing the moment to settle, allowing him to absorb it fully, because this was not about proving anything. It was about revealing what had always been true, even before he laid a hand on her jacket. Brooks finally inhaled, the breath subtle but necessary, and straightened slightly as if posture alone could restore balance. "Judge," he began, the word catching just slightly before it fully formed, and that hesitation, small as it was, echoed louder than anything he had said all morning. Vanessa closed the holder with a soft click, the sound crisp in the quiet air, and lowered her hand calmly. Her expression unchanged, her composure intact, as if nothing about this moment required adjustment on her part. "Federal Judge Vanessa Cole," she said, her voice even, not raised, not emphasized, just stated, and yet it carried across the space with a clarity that silenced what remained of the murmurs around them. Brooks felt it then, not just as a realization, but as a shift in position, like the ground beneath him had moved without warning, because this was not just a title, this was not just authority. This was proximity to power that operated on an entirely different level than the one he was used to enforcing. A man in a dark suit near the steps reached into his pocket, glancing toward another individual across the entrance. A silent exchange passing between them that spoke of coordination, awareness, readiness. Brooks opened his mouth again, searching for footing, for something to say that could stabilize the situation, but the words did not come easily now, because every option he considered felt smaller than the moment he was standing in. Vanessa took a single step forward, not closing distance in a confrontational way, but in a way that redefined the space between them, her presence steady, grounded, controlled, and when she spoke again, her tone did not change, but the meaning behind it sharpened. "Officer Brooks, I would advise you to be very clear about your next action." And that was not a threat, not a warning delivered with force. It was something else entirely, something colder, something precise. The kind of statement that did not need volume to carry consequence. The air held still around them. The courthouse steps no longer just a place of movement and noise, but a stage where something irreversible had already begun, and for the first time that morning, the authority Brooks had relied on so completely was no longer the most powerful thing present. The words settled into the air with a quiet weight that did not need repetition, and for a moment, Officer Daniel Brooks stood there without moving, his posture still upright, his shoulders still squared, but something behind that stance had shifted, something less visible but far more important, because authority, once questioned in the open, does not return the same way it left. His eyes flicked briefly to the people around them, and what he saw there was not the passive agreement he was used to, not the silent acceptance that followed his commands, but attention, sharp and focused, the kind that observes, instead of obeys, the kind that remembers. He cleared his throat, adjusting his footing as if grounding himself in the physical space could steady what was happening internally. "Judge Cole, I was just following protocol," he said, the sentence measured, careful, chosen with more thought than anything he had said earlier, and that alone marked the difference, because before, his words had come quickly, confidently, without hesitation, and now each one felt placed, weighed, considered. "Vanessa." Cole did not immediately respond, and that pause, intentional and controlled, carried more impact than a quick reply ever could, because it forced the moment to stretch, forced him to sit inside it, to feel the shift rather than move past it. A light breeze passed again, brushing against the steps, and somewhere behind them, a courthouse door opened with a muted sound, followed by the faint echo of footsteps approaching, steady, purposeful, not rushed but clearly directed. Brooks noticed it, even if he did not turn right away, because something in the air had changed once more, something that no longer centered around him. "Protocol requires reasonable cause," Vanessa said finally, her voice calm, even, precise, each word articulated in a way that left no room for interpretation. "And it requires discretion," she added, her gaze steady, not confrontational, but unwavering. The kind of look that does not challenge, it clarifies. Brooks nodded slightly, too quickly, as if agreement might restore alignment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the words coming out almost automatically. But the formality now carried a different meaning, no longer a routine acknowledgement, but a recognition of position, of hierarchy, of something he had not accounted for when this began. From the corner of his vision, he caught movement, two individuals in dark suits stepping onto the lower section of the courthouse steps, their pace controlled, their attention fixed, and though they had not yet spoken, their presence alone altered the balance of the scene. Vanessa shifted her attention briefly toward them, then back to Brooks, not seeking confirmation, not asking for intervention, simply acknowledging what was already unfolding. This location, she continued, her tone unchanged, is part of an active federal review, and the phrasing was deliberate, not dramatic, not emphasized, but structured in a way that carried implication. The kind that expands outward the moment it is understood. Brooks felt it immediately, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that the situation he thought he was managing had layers he had not seen, had context he had not been aware of, and that realization settled into him heavier than any direct accusation could have. One of the suited individuals reached the midpoint of the steps, stopping just short of joining them, maintaining a distance that was respectful but intentional. As if the line between observation and involvement was carefully measured, the crowd, once loosely gathered, now held a different shape, quieter, more attentive. Phones no longer raised casually but held steady, capturing not just a moment, but a shift. Brooks inhaled again, slower this time, and for the first time since this began, he allowed a fraction of silence to pass without filling it, because speaking no longer guaranteed control, and acting without understanding now carried a risk he could feel, but not yet define. Vanessa watched him, not with judgment, not with visible emotion, but with clarity, the kind that sees a situation for exactly what it is, no more, no less. And when she spoke again, her voice remained level, steady, grounded. You are standing in the middle of something you do not yet understand. And the statement did not accuse, did not threaten. It simply stated a truth that had already begun to unfold around them. The suited figures took another step forward, the sound of their shoes against the stone steps quiet but unmistakable, and in that moment, the space that had once belonged entirely to Officer Daniel Brooks no longer did, because control had not been taken from him forcefully. It had been revealed as something he never fully had in the first place. The sound of approaching footsteps did not rush the moment. It defined it, steady and measured against the stone steps, each step carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And as the two suited figures came into clearer view, the atmosphere shifted once again, not abruptly, but decisively, like a line being drawn that everyone could feel but no one had yet crossed. Officer Daniel Brooks turned his head slightly now, no longer able to ignore the presence behind him, and in that brief glance, something in his expression tightened, not fear, not yet, but recognition of a structure larger than his immediate control. The men did not speak right away, they did not interrupt, they simply arrived within the space, their posture composed, their attention focused, as if the situation had already been assessed long before they stepped into it. Vanessa Cole remained where she stood, her stance unchanged, her calm intact, and in that stillness, she did not appear as someone waiting for assistance, but as someone who had anticipated this exact moment. One of the suited individuals, a tall man with a clean, deliberate presence, stopped a few feet to her side, not positioning himself between her and Brooks, but aligning himself with the situation in a way that subtly shifted its center. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, his voice even, respectful, carrying a tone that confirmed what had already been revealed, and with that single sentence, any remaining ambiguity dissolved completely. Brooks straightened further, instinctively, as if posture alone could respond to what words could not yet process. "I was not aware," he began, his voice measured but thinner than before. And the admission, though incomplete, hung in the air as more than just a statement. It was a realization forming in real time. The second suited individual stepped forward slightly, holding a slim folder in one hand, the edges worn just enough to suggest it had been opened and reviewed many times. And though he did not hand it over immediately, the presence of it carried meaning, documentation, structure, something formal and irreversible. "Officer Brooks," the man said calmly, his tone neutral, not confrontational, but precise. "We have been trying to locate you." And the phrasing was careful, deliberate, as if each word had been chosen to carry weight without escalation. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd again, sharper this time, more focused, because this was no longer an isolated interaction. It had expanded, connected, revealed itself as part of something larger. Brooks felt it fully now, not as a vague discomfort, but as a clear shift. In position, the ground beneath him no longer uncertain, but changed, definitively. And for the first time since the encounter began, he did not immediately respond, because response required understanding, and understanding was still catching up. Vanessa turned her head slightly toward the suited man, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and in that subtle movement, it became clear that this was not an interruption to her moment. It was a continuation of it. "We can proceed," she said, her voice calm, controlled, as if the timing of everything unfolding had already been accounted for. And that sentence, simple as it was, carried the weight of direction, of authority that did not ask for agreement. The man with the folder opened it carefully, the soft sound of paper shifting barely audible against the quiet tension around them. And though he did not read from it immediately, the act itself signaled something formal, something structured, something that did not rely on improvisation or reaction. Brooks glanced briefly at the folder, then back at Vanessa, and in that exchange, something settled into place. Not acceptance, not yet, but the understanding that whatever was happening had moved beyond his ability to control it through presence alone. "This review," the suited man continued, his voice steady, "concerns multiple field interactions," and he paused, just long enough for the implication to land, not as an accusation, but as context, including this morning, he added, the words precise, unembellished, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The air held still again. But this time it was not anticipation, it was confirmation, the moment no longer building towards something unknown, but revealing what had already been set in motion. Vanessa watched Brooks with the same calm clarity she had maintained from the beginning, not reacting, not pressing, simply allowing the structure around them to speak for itself, because the truth did not need to be forced, it only needed to be seen. And as Brooks stood there, the weight of the moment settled fully, not through confrontation, not through volume, but through something far more powerful, the quiet realization that the authority he had relied on had not just been challenged, it had been placed under something higher, something he could no longer ignore. There was no sudden reaction, no dramatic interruption, just a quiet shift that settled deeper than anything that had come before, because now the moment was no longer about uncertainty. It was about recognition, and recognition carries a different kind of weight, the kind that does not need to be explained. Officer Daniel Brooks stood still, his gaze moving briefly from the open folder to the suited man holding it, then back to Judge Vanessa Cole, and in that movement, something inside him recalibrated, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to understand that the situation had crossed a line he could not step back over. The morning air felt cooler now, or maybe it was the absence of control that made everything sharper, more defined, because when certainty fades, every detail becomes louder. A faint click echoed as one of the reporters adjusted a camera lens, no longer pretending this was routine, no longer treating it as background noise. And that subtle shift in attention mattered, because moments like this do not just happen, they get witnessed, recorded, remembered. We have documented multiple interactions over the past several months. The suited man continued, his tone steady, not accusatory, but structured, the kind of voice that reads facts without needing to emphasize them. And a pattern has been identified. He added, pausing briefly, allowing the words to settle, not rushing them, not softening them, simply letting them exist. Brooks inhaled slowly, his chest rising just enough to signal that he was processing, not reacting. And for the first time, he did not attempt to interrupt, did not attempt to redirect, because the space no longer responded to his voice the way it had before. Vanessa remained composed, her presence unchanged, but now there was a clarity around her role that had fully taken shape. No longer subtle, no longer implied. It was defined, structured, undeniable. This morning's interaction, the man continued, glancing briefly at the folder before returning his gaze forward, has been added to the active review. And though the sentence was simple, its meaning expanded outward, connecting the present moment to something much larger, something that had not started here and would not end here. A low murmur moved through the crowd again, softer this time, less about curiosity and more about understanding. Because people were no longer trying to figure out what was happening, they were beginning to realize what had already happened. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but noticeable. as if the ground beneath him no longer felt stable, in the way it had just minutes ago, and his voice, when it came, was quieter, more measured. "I was conducting a standard inquiry," he said, the words careful, almost rehearsed, but even as he spoke them, they felt insufficient, disconnected from the reality forming around him. Vanessa's gaze held steady, not dismissing his statement, not engaging with it directly, simply allowing it to exist without altering the trajectory of the moment, because what mattered now was not what he believed he was doing, but what had been observed, recorded, and understood. The second suited man stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, not intrusively, but with a presence that suggested transition, that something was moving from observation into action, even if that action was quiet, procedural, controlled. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone still even, still composed, "you are not being asked to explain anything at this time." And that clarification, delivered without force, carried a weight that settled heavily, because it removed the need for defense, and in doing so, it removed the illusion that defense would change anything. Brooks' jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in adjustment, the kind that comes when reality does not match expectation, and for a brief second, his eyes moved again, scanning the faces around him, seeing not support, not alignment, but observation, steady and unblinking. Vanessa finally took a small step to the side, not away, not retreating, but repositioning, creating a subtle space that allowed the process unfolding around them to continue without obstruction. And in that movement, it became clear that this was no longer about her standing against him. It was about the system moving forward. The folder closed with a soft, deliberate sound, and in that quiet motion, something final settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that could not be undone, because what had started as a moment of assumed authority had now fully transformed into something else entirely, something structured, documented, and beyond the reach of the man who had unknowingly set it in motion. The moment did not escalate, it settled, and that was what made it irreversible, because there was no chaos to blame, no confusion to hide behind, only clarity unfolding in real time as every piece quietly aligned into place. Officer Daniel Brooks stood in that clarity now, not resisting it, not fully accepting it, but unable to escape it, and the difference showed not in what he said, but in what he no longer attempted to control. The suited man holding the folder adjusted it slightly, the motion small but intentional, and when he spoke again, his tone remained consistent, measured, anchored in procedure rather than emotion, effective immediately. "Your field activity is being reviewed under federal oversight," he said, each word spaced with precision, allowing no room for misinterpretation, no space for negotiation. The sentence did not echo, but it carried, moving through the gathered crowd with a quiet force that replaced curiosity with understanding, because now there was no ambiguity left, no question about what this moment had become. Brooks' shoulders remained squared, but the tension within them shifted, no longer the tension of command, but of containment, as if he were holding himself in place while everything around him moved forward without him. "You are expected to remain available for further inquiry," the second suited man added, his voice calm, steady, not raised, not aggressive, but firm in a way that did not require reinforcement, and that expectation, simple as it sounded, carried a weight that extended beyond the steps, beyond the morning, into something ongoing, something that would not end when this crowd dispersed. A faint sound of movement came from behind, the courthouse doors opening wider now as more individuals stepped into view, their presence not hurried, not disruptive, but aligned, coordinated, reinforcing what had already been set in motion. Vanessa Cole stood just slightly apart, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer central in the way it had been at the beginning, but foundational, like the axis around which everything else had turned. She did not speak immediately, and that silence, consistent and controlled, allowed the moment to breathe, allowed its meaning to fully settle without interruption. Brooks glanced toward her once more, and this time, there was no assumption in his gaze, no assertion, only recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already happened. "Judge Cole," he said, his voice quieter now, measured, stripped of the sharpness it carried before, and though the words were formal, they held something else beneath them, something closer to understanding than resistance. Vanessa met his gaze, steady as before, and for a brief second, the noise of the surroundings faded again, not completely, but enough to isolate the exchange between them, because in that moment, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. "This is not about a single moment," she said, her tone calm, even, carrying no anger, no emphasis, just truth stated plainly. "It is about what moments reveal when no one thinks they are being seen." And the sentence moved through the air with a quiet finality, not as a conclusion, but as a frame that placed everything that had happened into context. Brooks did not respond, not immediately, because the meaning did not require a reply. It required understanding, and understanding was still settling into place. The suited men stepped back slightly, not withdrawing, but repositioning, allowing the structure they represented to remain present without dominating the space. Because their role was not to overwhelm, it was to formalize what had already been revealed. The crowd, once loosely gathered, now began to shift again, but differently this time, not dispersing out of disinterest, but moving, with the awareness that they had just witnessed something significant, something that would carry beyond the steps, beyond the morning. A reporter lowered his camera slowly, his expression no longer searching, but certain, while a pair of attorneys exchanged a quiet glance, the kind that acknowledged a moment that would not be easily forgotten. Brooks remained where he was, not directed to move, not forced to act, but held in place by something far more powerful than instruction, the realization that the authority he had relied on had not just been questioned, it had been placed within a system that would now examine it from above. Vanessa turned slightly toward the courthouse entrance, her movement calm, unhurried, as if this moment, while significant, was only one part of a larger process already in motion. And as she took her first step forward, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, because the balance of power had not shifted through confrontation, it had shifted through truth, revealed at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. The courthouse doors closed softly behind Vanessa Cole, the sound almost lost in the quiet murmur of the crowd. But its meaning lingered, because some moments do not end with noise, they end with understanding. The steps that had once felt like a stage of control now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by authority, but by awareness. And Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing in that silence, his posture still firm, his presence still visible, but no longer defining the space around him. The suited men had stepped back just enough to allow the process to continue without obstruction, their role no longer to intervene, but to ensure that what had been set in motion would not be interrupted. And in that subtle shift, the moment transitioned from confrontation into consequence. Brooks looked toward the courthouse entrance where Vanessa had disappeared, and for the first time, his gaze did not search for validation or dominance. It searched for understanding, for context, for something that could explain how quickly everything had changed. But the answer was already there, not hidden, not complex, just something he had not seen when it mattered most. Around him, the crowd began to move again, slowly at first. Conversations resuming in low tones, footsteps echoing against the stone, but the energy had changed, no longer casual, no longer indifferent, because what they had witnessed was not just an interaction, it was a revelation, a moment where assumption met reality and did not survive the encounter. A reporter spoke quietly into a microphone, his voice steady, measured, describing what had just unfolded without needing to exaggerate it, because the truth, as it stood, was already enough. Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing not because the situation had resolved, but because it had clarified, and clarity, even when uncomfortable, carries a different kind of weight than uncertainty. He adjusted his uniform slightly, a small, almost instinctive movement, as if restoring order to something physical could steady what was shifting internally. But this was not about appearance, it was about recognition, about seeing the difference between control and accountability, between assumption and fact. The suited man with the folder glanced toward him once more, not with judgment, not with hostility, but with the calm neutrality of someone who understands that the process has already begun, and that what happens next is no longer decided in moments like this, but in the structure that follows them. Brooks nodded faintly, not in agreement, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a quiet acceptance that the situation had moved beyond his influence. That whatever came next would not be shaped by what he said here, but by what had already been. Observed, the morning continued around him, the city moving forward as it always did, cars passing in the distance, voices rising and falling, life resuming its rhythm. But for those who had stood on those steps, something remained, a shift in perspective, a reminder that power is not defined by volume, not sustained by assumption, but revealed in the moments where it is tested and seen clearly for what it truly is. And as Brooks stood there, no longer at the center of the scene, but still within its consequences, one truth settled quietly into place, steady and undeniable. That day did not take his authority away. It showed him what it was never meant to be, because he thought he was the one enforcing the law. But what he did not realize was that the law had been watching him the entire time.